is very interesting. And then we are super excited because we will have Tania joining us. And yeah, Tania is a developer advocate from Microsoft, and she's going to tell us something about Jupyter Notebook, which I'm super excited. It's one of my favorite things. So let's welcome Tania. Hello.
Hi,
Tania, can you
how's
hear me?
everyone?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good. Yeah, I think that yeah, I can see your screen. So yeah, just take us away. Thank you.
Fantastic. So I'm going to start. Uh, yeah. Hello, my name is Tania Allard, and as my friend Terry introduced me, I am a developer advocate at Microsoft, and I'm going to be talking about getting started with Jupyterlab extensions. For those of you that don't know me, this is me. You already saw my screen, my wallpaper, sorry, so you can tell that I am a bit obsessed with all things Outrun and retro aesthetics. I'm also a Python Software Foundation Fellow. I love Python. I work mostly in the machine learning, data science ecosystem. And I love mechanical keyboards as well. So if anyone, I tell it all the time. So if anyone wants to talk about mechanical keyboards, please hit me up. Or if you want to reach out for anything about my presentation, you can find all of my contact details at my website that is trallard.dev. And also something that probably everybody knows is I love Jupyterlab. But more than that, I think I just love the whole Jupyter ecosystem. Over the years, I think I have named myself the unofficial advocate for Jupyter because I still have to find like a presentation or a tutorial in which I don't mention something of the ecosystem. And something that I really, really appreciate of the whole Jupyter ecosystem and interfaces and tools is that everything is extensible, everything is stackable. So the best way to think about how the Jupyter ecosystem is put together is thinking about Lego blocks. If you're familiar with Lego blocks, you know that you all have certain pieces that come in certain shapes, colors, and with those stackable pieces, you can build pretty much anything you want. And that is like very low key the same principle of Jupyter Lab. They give you those stackable pieces, and then they empower yourself. Well, they empower all the users and developers to build on these amazing building blocks. So probably a lot of you might have heard about Jupyter Notebooks, but I'm talking about Jupyterlab in this presentation, which is the web-based user interface for Project Jupyter. So if you work locally, for example, on Jupyter Notebooks, what's going to happen is you're going to do Jupyterlab, start your server, and you're going to have a web browser tab or window open. You don't need to have internet connectivity for you to be able to work locally, but it also allows you to talk to other remote machines or other computers. And Jupyter Lab is pretty much the evolution of the original Jupyter Notebooks experience. It has moved a bit more towards an IDE approach where you can have your terminal, your notebooks, text editors. You have like a nice sidebar, top bar. I know that a lot of folks still like the more traditional or the original interface because it was very clean and you could have like a single notebook without a lot of the extras. But I found the Jupyter notebook is really nice. It's real extensible. And one of the reasons people are going to ask me, like, why would I even want to write an extension? One of that is there are many ways in which you can bring, for example, programs or tools that integrate with Jupyter Notebooks. But or with Jupyter Lab, but if you develop an extension, you're already giving them something that works on top of their stack and their favorite tools. So you're already reducing the adoption barriers. They are already going to be familiar with the stack, with the whole environment. And also, nice thing is that it is self-contained. So it can be directly installed, linked, and activated within Jupyterlab or through the command line. So you have to eliminate, like in this way, you eliminate additional baggage and you allow folks to focus on the real problem. As I said, like in my very, very first presentations, the whole Jupyter ecosystem is built on the premise of extensibility. So having a combination of Jupyterlab plus a lot of extensions or a number of extensions, it allows you as a developer or as a user to create new editors and output visualization. So if you need something that needs like very, very high vis or special output, then you can do that and outsource it to the world. You can also pretty much customize add buttons, add menus that will make your experience and your users' experience or your community experience much better. And also, on a more back-end side of things, you can also provide APIs for other extensions. And one of the extensions that I really like that has this approach is an extension called Kaylee, which basically allows you to run Jupyter notebooks directly as Kubeflow workflows or pipelines. And that is like it's like magic because when you're developing on Jupyter notebooks and then you want to move that into Kubeflow, you have to do a lot of manipulation sometimes, and then you have to keep two sources. Like you can convert your notebooks, of course, using NV convert, but it's like extra overhead. But what this extension does and what other extensions does very well is provide APIs to other tools or extensions in the open source ecosystem. What else? From the practicality or usability, I've already mentioned that if you have an extension in Jupyterlab, you can run it locally, you can run it on your own machine, but you can also run it on somebody else's machine. If, for example, your company or your university has a cloud provider using something like Azure, for example, you can deploy your Jupyter Hub and allow everyone in your company to access it and have like that nice interface with all the extensions. Again, it aligns with the broader ecosystem principles of extensibility, empowering the whole community through open tools and open infrastructure. And although we are now seeing that pretty much any IDE has its own flavor of support for Jupyter notebooks, for example, VS Code now has like a really good support for Jupyter notebooks. Jupyterlab and like the vanilla Jupyter notebook interface is still one of the most popular interfaces for users to interact and work with notebooks. So, how do you even get started? I imagine that for a lot of us that are not so much into the front end stuff, but are more like back end data science, machine learning kind of folks, it all seems like so complex because it is a web based tool. So, what are the major hurdles that you're gonna experience? And I'm gonna tell you about my own experience. I thought, well, I'm decent-ish at doing front-end stuff. I know like TypeScript. I know a bit of like different frameworks. I know how to connect back-end and front-end. So this was my expectation, right? Like I know Python. I'm familiar with Jupyterlab. I'm familiar with notebooks. Like how hard can it be? And this was my reality. This was my experience when I first wanted to develop my extension. Like, what like I couldn't make a sense of a lot of stuff. And this was because as I was going through the documentation, as I was going through my setup, as I was doing like following even some examples, I had all of these questions like, do I really need an account? Like, is this more like front-endy? So why do I need Anaconda? How much JavaScript or TypeScript do I need to know? Like I know TypeScript enough to write VS Code extensions, for example, but I'm by no means a TypeScript or a JavaScript expert. Also, it's like, okay, so how do I even get started? How do I understand how all the small building blocks fit into the Jupyterlab? And where can I find more information about these components? And I think my personal blocker, especially because I've said it a lot, I'm not a front-end expert. I could not find that many practical examples in the documentation or using my search for skills. Probably my search for skills are not as good as I think they are, um, but I couldn't find a lot of practical examples out there. So I did go through the documentation, through the tutorial. They have a nice tutorial for an astronomy. What is it? The NASA picture of the day extension. So as soon as you open Jupyterlab, you'll see an extension there. There are a few examples. But something that really, really helped me was going through the code of other extensions that folks have been creating before. Especially Jeremy Tulop. I love his code. He has written some really, really, really nice extensions. And that gave me a lot of understanding on how everything is put together. And some of the nice things that I notice is that in general, like the Jupyter ecosystem does encourage good coding standards. Most of the extensions that I found and the examples and the sample extensions that the team has out there are very clean, well-documented code, so I can follow through. In general, extensions are a mixture of Python and TypeScript. So it's not just TypeScript, and TypeScript is actually quite new. It's actually, sorry, quite nice. And it also makes it very nice for folks that are more on the UX side of things to work on. It makes it nicer and easier. And there are also a number of cookie cutter templates out there. So you don't have to build everything from scratch. You can start with a nice template. You can start with a nice directory structure. And I always appreciate that because that is extra overhead that I sometimes don't want to deal with. And the good is, once you get your development workflow and environment, you actually get into a nice development workflow and steps, and you can make use of like watch and live reload, so you can actually see your changes reflected. Some of the problems that I actually found when working or developing extensions is that the build times can be very, very long. They're quite slow. And this is because it's a multi-step process for you to be able to build your extension, relink it, and then you have to build Jupyterlab. Although there are cookie cutters out there that makes the initial starting point easier and more seamless, there's not always I'm sorry, I just need to check that. It doesn't always mean that it's going to be super easy to have a finished, oh, I don't know why I wrote container, a finished extension or finished product. And also, managing dependencies is hard. I know this is hard already in the Python ecosystem, but then we also have to deal with other dependencies because of the front end component, and it is you have to be very careful, especially to allow compatibility across the different versions of Jupyterlab. I can't remember exactly when we migrated from 1 point something to 2 point something, but now also we have the release candidate for Jupyter 3.0 out. So again, managing those compatibilities can be a lot of pain. So if I've kind of now started to giving you a bit of interest in developing your own extensions, here are some tips that I've learned from my own experience and talking to others that are actually much more experienced writing Jupyter notebook extensions. Independencies, and I say this all the time again, it's not just for reproducibility. and for collaboration, but also I recommend pinning all of your Jupyterlab dependencies in your package.json. I'm going to go into this a bit more, as well as the version of Jupyterlab required in setup.py. This is going to help you with a lot of headaches. It is very easy to accidentally break compatibility um, if you don't pin your dependencies or your versions, and like even small changes uh, in the package can lead to massive chaos. As it happens, you're gonna eventually find that your Jupyterlab packages in package.json will not be truly compatible in terms of sub-dependencies. So make sure that you are using the resolution section of the package.json to force these packages to use certain versions for interdependencies. Interdependencies agreement. And this is briefly these are briefly the steps that you're gonna feel going to follow us as you're developing your extension. You first are going to need to create a code environment. There are ways around it, but actually is the most straightforward way to do it. You're going to then need to install your server extension locally, so that you can actually work on it and reflect changes. Then you're going to have to build your TypeScript components, which is the front end side of things, link your extension locally to your Jupyterlab, so that when you start your server, you actually can access the extension as well as the main Jupyterlab web served front end. You then need to build Jupyterlab, and there might need to be additional steps depending on your extension, depending on what it does. For example, if it's an extension that talks to other APIs or other tools, you might need to do authentication or other stuff on the back. So, and actually, the steps from build your TypeScript components to the other things are steps that you're going to be constantly doing. And as I said before, the problem is that it can take so long. There are many ways in which you can actually do the build. But I found that the two that works the best are using Conda for your environment and Yarn to build the actual TypeScript components, because it overall reduces the time. It's quite intuitive. If you're already familiar developing some JavaScript-based projects, it just works out. Also, the Jupyterlab team have worked on JLPM that basically will give you some commands similar to Yarn to install all of the dependencies. All of the dependencies build your components and actually enable a watch mode, so you can see in live time the changes to your extension. And the nice thing is that they already have a code environment code environment specification that from which you can create your own code environment. It will add JLPM, and you don't have to worry about like other nuances. So if you're thinking about getting started with extensions, I recommend you using any of these two approaches for you to build them. I have noticed, if you're familiar with NPM, for example, it is the slowest, and I found a lot of issues when trying to build my extensions. And the next step is I've already given you some tips on how to get started, what you need to do from the practical and technical side of things, but let's familiarize us a bit with the stack and with the actual workflow that you're going to need. So the first thing is when you go to this took me a while to figure out. When you go to the Jupyterlab GitHub repo, you're going to see many directories with a lot of coding of scripts and files inside them. And the reason is that this is a monorepo, so it has all of the components and all of the different bits that you need to bring together the whole Jupyterlab tool. But if you're developing extensions, the two main directories that you have to look into and where you're going to find actual things is Jupyterlab, which is the actual backend code. This contains things like handlers commands, debugs, debugging capability, extension setup, and the such. And in packages is where you're going to find the core extensions, meaning all the extensions that are inbuilt in Jupyterlab. So there's like applications, utils, code editor, notebook, and so on. So this is what you actually need to familiarize yourself with to start building your extensions. As I mentioned before, you're gonna you can, if you follow the tutorial or go to the development guide, the easier way to get started is creating your Conda environment. There's also something that I forgot to mention when I was talking about dependencies and dependencies resolution. When you're doing this, limit your Conda channels because this will also significantly improve or reduce the times of your build. I just tend to stick to Conda for it, and it works as nice and as easy as it can be. Then the next step is using cookie cutter. Don't start from scratch. I totally recommend using cookie cutter because it gives you a nice scaffolding. There is a cookie cutter for extensions in TypeScript, extensions on vanilla JavaScript, one for themes, and I think there is another one that I can't remember. It might be widgets. But it gives you this nice scaffolding where things are already where they have to be. It gives you a starting package JSON that has all of the internal Jupyterlab applications imports, so you don't have to worry about that, and that's like super nice. And once you have that, then the next step is to actually install your dependencies, build a TypeScript source, and leave your development version of the extension with Jupyterlab. As I mentioned before, I've been using Yarn. It works, it's nice. I don't have to worry. Well, sometimes I just leave stuff building and then go make a coffee, come back, and it's all done. And again, Yarn, if you have been using it for front-end stuff or like developing apps or stuff, you know that it comes with a watch functionality or watch command. So as you're making changes on your extension, you can actually see them in a live reload. Now, if you remember, I talked about these core extensions that are within the GitHub repo, and this have to be specified in your package.json, depending on what type of extension you're working on. So you have application, app utils, notebook, and Lumino. Again, make sure that you are pinning all of the versions to ensure compatibility of the sub-dependencies as well as with the version of Jupyterlab that you are using and targeting. And there you're going to find in the cookie cutter, if you go to any other extension, that you're going to have an index.ts file in the src, and that's where all the magic happens. That's where your whole extension code is going to live. And that's where you're actually importing those dependencies like Jupyterlab application, Jupyterlab notebook, Jupyterlab Lumino, for example, depending on what you're doing. And this index, this is an extension object that runs everything. This is going to do all of the functionality of your app. So make sure that everything is contained there. And then just like some guidelines, because we're working with both Python and TypeScript, and of course, like CSS files or Sass. Make sure that all the TypeScript files are in src. I've had in the past problems saying that something doesn't exist, or I can't add components, and that's because I forgot to put everything in src or reference to where those files were. Keep everything tidy in place. I don't, for example, I prefer using SAS for styling sheets, but you do need to have all your style sheets in CSS. So what I do is I compile SAS, generate CSS files, but make sure that everything is in style, that you're using the import, and that you're importing them directly in index.css, because that is going to create the whole HTML file for Jupyterlab. And if you're adding icons or images, stick to SVG. One of the reasons being that SVG scales very nicely, regardless of the resolution, the size, and stuff, and keep everything in icons. And finally, one of the things that has helped me a lot when building extensions is actually using continuous integration and continuous delivery. I use GitHub Actions for this because it allows me to keep everything self-contained. I have my repo in GitHub, and so my actions. So I have an action that does all of the building, does the testing of everything in my extension, and then as soon as I create a tag, then all I need is as well my npm token. That is where, well, for example, for some extensions I need an npm token because they're going to live there, or I can build whatever kind of installation package you need, and I don't have to worry about that. That's a step less that I have to worry about that, but it also allows me to test different different platforms and different build environments. So I hope that this has given you a bit of an idea on how to get started with Jupyterlab extensions, and just like some good practices. And if you want if you want to reach out for further resources on how to get started or examples, please reach out, get in touch. There is my website, and I think I went over for a minute.
That's okay. Thank you so much, Tania. It's an amazing talk. So yeah, I'm afraid that people will have to find you on Discord for further discussion. And also, you will be back on stage at 2 p.m., like 3 hours from now, right? So
I will.
yeah, make sure that you come back and you can ask Tania more questions during the time then. So thank you so much, Tania. I will let you have a break right now. And